afternoon. This webinar is Bringing the Past to Life, Reader's Advisory for Historical Fiction. And I have a fantastic co-host with me today. Lee, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Lee Thomas. I'm the branch manager with the New Hanover County Public Library System. I have been in libraries for 15 years, and I'm currently closing in on my ninth year here with New Hanover County. Currently, I am reading A Treachery of Swans by A.B. Poranek, which is a retelling of Swan Lake. I've also been listening to the audiobook of The Everlasting by Alex E. Haro. It's about a time-traveling scholar and the female knight from legend that he falls in love with. My favorite genres include obviously historical fiction, fantasy, romance, and the occasional cozy mystery.
All right. And I'm Devin Waugh, the instruction librarian for NC Live. I'm currently reading America America, A New History of the New World by Greg Grandin. And I am listening to the audiobook of Real by Kennedy Ryan for a book club coming up at the end of this week. So my favorite kind of doorways in particularly reading fiction, but also nonfiction, are setting and language. I love to feel a strong sense of place and getting to experience a country or even a world or fantasy setting that feels very immersive. I'm a big fan of all things mystery, cozy to more on the gritty side, and I love when it's mixed in with supernatural elements, multiple perspectives, and ambiguous endings. And I pretty much will read any music memoir or biography that you put in front of me. So, with that, for our agenda today, we're going to start off with background and some key titles. Lee will also share some of the picks that she's made for the book club that she leads in New Hanover County. I'll walk you through some tips and tricks for using novelists to search for historical fiction titles, both for adult readers as well as YA and ages 9 through 12. And then we'll wrap up with some best practices and some resources and make sure that we have some time for questions. So, kicking off with background and key titles, we want to ask you all if you could share in the chat what historical fiction titles and authors do you like? So, feel free to share any titles, authors. Ooh, yeah, The Lincoln
Lincoln Highway.
Highway. So
Okay,
good.
Quinn. Yeah. I met her a few years ago at PLA. She's awesome.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Fiona Davis. Yeah, and Marie Benedict.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I'm glad you're joining as part of a genre that's unfamiliar. And Wind Sharing Isola by Allegra Goodman, and then The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead.
It's a
Awesome.
fantastic book.
hmm and then if you want to share in the chat, what historical fiction titles or authors do your patrons like? And if there are particular themes or time periods that you notice are popular with your patrons, feel free to add those to the chat as well. All right, so a lot of folks like historical fiction set in North Carolina here at my
Hmm.
library. Marie Benedict and Beatrice Williams. Oh, Tobacco Wives. Have you heard of this book, Lee?
I have.
Okay,
I was actually looking at that earlier today.
nice.
Oh, yeah, Kristen Hanna. Perennial favorite.
hmm And gotten very popular through social media in the
Oh,
last
yeah.
couple of years as well. That's something that we'll kind of touch on later in the webinar today is
Hmm.
just how certain titles have taken off through Book Talk and Bookstagram and how you can pull in those titles as well as read alikes to facilitate some of that discovery. Nice.
All right. So, what makes a title historical fiction? This is kind of a bigger question than you might think. So, something that differentiates historical fiction from literary fiction that kind of just happens to be set in the past is more of a focus on historical accuracy and detail. Historical fiction tends to examine the cultural and societal norms of a time period. It can include very vivid descriptions of places, clothing, food, and traditions, among other elements of the period, to kind of help transport a reader to a distinct time period. Whereas in literary fiction, time period is almost more set dressing. There's going to be less of an emphasis on accurately recreating the time period in literary fiction. It is not uncommon for authors of historical fiction to conduct extensive research on time periods. You've probably read a few books, if you're a big reader of historical fiction, where authors will include source lists or a list of all the places that they did their research in crafting their novel. A Classic novels are not necessarily historical fiction, though there are some examples. But somebody like Jane Austen, for instance, she was writing for a contemporary audience at the time that she was writing. So it would have been familiar to her readers at the time, so it doesn't really qualify as historical fiction, even though she's talking about, like, societal norms and culture. She's not attempting to tell a story about the past. Um, Another thing when it comes to historical fiction is there can be subgenres. Historical fiction can absolutely cross genres. Elements from mystery and romance are very common within historical fiction and generally are pretty well accepted. But there are some subgenres that people can have much more mixed feelings about. A novel, for example, might choose to incorporate elements of magical realism through characters that, say, for instance, practice witchcraft. So you might find them in stories set in antiquity where gods were perceived as being very present in people's day-to-day lives. And some readers will struggle with those elements and the inclusion of them, kind of depending to the level to which the author might utilize them. But this is also something that can be a really good point of discussion when it comes to how your book club, like when you're discussing how effectively the author utilized these elements and why they may have chosen to include them. And the last thing I think is actually one of the bigger questions when it comes to historical fiction, which is how far back counts as historical fiction. And unfortunately, there is not a really clear answer on this. I was doing some research on this, and the Historical Writers Association uses 35 years back as their standard for membership. To win the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, the book has to be set 60 years in the past. 50 years is kind of offered up as being far back enough that the past feels distinct from the present. Um, Books like set in World War II are pretty much accepted by everybody as a valid time period. But, 51 years ago, that is the end of the Vietnam War. So if you're going by the 60-year standard, it doesn't count. But I think a lot of people would argue that that's a very culturally distinct time period and a very significant time period. The other thing is that 50 years is still well within living memory for many people. I'm 43. I'm not personally ready to accept 35 years as historical fiction. But like in general, for something to be historical fiction, it needs to be distinct from the modern day. It really should not feel modern, and it should depict a specific and often historically important time period or span of period. But kind of within that definition, you have some wiggle room. And so back in 2024, there was an article in Library Journal on forthcoming historical fiction novels and kind of these key trends to watch out for. And in this article, the author mentioned the popularity of World War II as a historical fiction setting. And they quoted an editor at St. Martin's who described it as an evergreen era. It is endlessly fascinating and moving and infuriating, but finding a truly new story in this well-explored subject area is rare. And the thing that I found really interesting about this quote is that it kind of gets to the heart of a few things when it comes to historical fiction. One of the first is that when we talk about historical fiction as a genre, there's kind of this like stereotypical image of a World War II novel set in London with a cover with a woman kind of glancing off in profile or away from the reader. You could probably walk to your shelf and pick out any number of books with this cover. But the second and kind of more important point I want to touch on is that it really hits at a deeper appetite, both in the publishing industry and with readers, for stories that they have not heard 100 times before. And if you start to look back, especially at the past several years of historical fiction releases, there are some key trends that are starting to kind of see emerge. You're going to see it in the popularity of books like Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which was recently adapted into a movie. And it focuses not on the life of the very famous William Shakespeare, but on the domestic world of his family. Um, we see it in books like The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride that focus on voices from marginalized communities. But we're also seeing a rise in appetites for stories that are told outside of America or Europe, and kind of a rise in these multi-generational stories or stories that span decades. And kind of as mentioned earlier, we're seeing this rise also in genre blends or stories that like will incorporate elements like fantastical elements like magical realism. So this month, my book club is actually reading A Death in Harlem, which is a historical mystery novel set in by a North Carolina author, and it's set during the Harlem Renaissance, and it depicts the world of the Jazz Age. Wayward by Amelia Hart. This was also a pick by my book club. It was a story that tells a story of these three women across the centuries, going back to the witch hunts of the 17th century. And as part of its narrative, it brings in these elements of magical realism to kind of tell the story of these women and the power of the natural world. Library of Legends. This one by Janie Chang incorporates legend and mythological beings. It is a story set in China in 1937 during the Second Sino-Japanese War. It depicts university students who have been entrusted with the care of a 500-year-old collection of stories about myths and legends while they're kind of fleeing this approaching Japanese army. And on this journey, they start to encounter some of these spirits of legend. And it's a really great example of a genre blend that was really, really well received by my book club. It was one of our favorite reads of the year. And then you also have authors like Madeline Miller, who she's retelling these stories from mythology, but as part of her writing process, she's doing really extensive historical research about the time period, and she's incorporating that into these retellings about to kind of help bring the world of antiquity to life. Now, when you're selecting titles for your book club, you want to kind of think about what time periods you want to cover. And you also really want to mix it up a lot so you're not focusing, too heavy on one particular era or too heavily on one particular place. So on this slide, you'll see a list of a few popular time periods that you're going to see. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but as part of your planning process, what you might want to do is sit down and kind of brainstorm a list of time periods you're interested in covering so that you're not inadvertently selecting, all World War II novels or all medieval books or these same time periods over and over again. You really kind of want to offer a variety of options. So a little bit about our book club here and a few of the titles that we've covered. So some of our picks this year, we did Hour of the Witch by Chris Bohjalian. This is a book about a Puritan woman seeking a divorce from her abusive husband. It is set a few decades before the Salem witch trials, and it kind of goes into her decision and the fallout that kind of comes from that. The thing that was really interesting about this novel was how well he brought this time period to life. He did an incredible amount of research into Puritan law and onto which grounds a woman could divorce her husband. Really wasn't an easy thing to do at the time. Very, very well researched book. We did The Island of Sea Women by Lisa See. This is a really great example of a historical fiction novel that kind of covers several of those key trends that I just mentioned. It's set on a remote Korean island, and it focuses on a very real community of female divers. It tells the story of a friendship between these two women on this island over the span of multiple decades. It covers, Korea under the rule of Japan, World War II, the division into North and South Korea, all the way up to the modern era. And then this past December, we read Hamnet. This book is about the life of Shakespeare's family. Our book discussion actually also happened to coincide with the release of the movie that just came out. So several of our members ended up going to see the movie, and they came back with opinions about their experience reading the book, how well the director had managed to adapt the film. So that's one thing that as you're kind of selecting your titles, kind of keep your eye on the horizon for things that are being adapted into film or television productions. Anytime something is adapted, there's going to be kind of a natural rise in interest in the source material, and it can be a really great way for your library to offer programming that's kind of in line with kind of what's happening. So, a few tips to consider. Look outside the bestseller lists. They can kind of be a mixed bag when it comes to book club selections. You are going to bring in some readers who may love a particular title or author, or who've been looking for a good reason to read a book that they've been meaning to read for a while. But a lot of your very avid readers, they may have already read the book and they're not very interested in rereading it. So if it's a title a lot of people have already read, you might find that they're a little more inclined to skip a meeting, or that they might be more interested in something that's kind of fresh and new to them. Explore a variety of time periods and places. Um, People definitely have their favorite time periods. I am a huge fan of the Tudor era, and I've read way too much in that time period. But people don't necessarily want to read about the same time. They don't want to read about the same place. Um, Historical fiction readers, I think in particular, are looking to learn about, different histories in different parts of the world. And part of your role when you're facilitating these book clubs is to kind of act as kind of a tour guide for your group. You want to take them to different places and time periods that they may not have explored before. Tie in your local history. Selecting titles that are set in your community or nearby communities can offer you the opportunity, to learn more about your community. It can be a good way to introduce other resources. If you have materials in your local history collections, you can use that as an opportunity to, show those to patrons. You want to look for titles that encourage really thoughtful discussion. The past shapes the present, and this is something that, with historical fiction in particular, it really tends to closely examine that and the relationship of the past to the present. So common themes are going to include, things like the experience and aftermath of war or other atrocities. It's going to have generational trauma, racism, sexism. Sometimes those are not easy topics for people to talk about, especially in open discussion, but they are really important things to have conversations about. One of the last tips I have for you is look for fresh perspectives on really familiar history. If you're choosing a popular time period, like let's say World War II, you might want to consider a part of the world that your group may not be as familiar with, or a story told from a point of view that's been traditionally underrepresented in the genre. So you want to ask yourself whose story is missing. A few hidden gems that we found also in our club. Take My Hand by Dolan Perkins Valdez, fantastic book. It is set in Alabama in the 1970s. It follows a nurse who discovers that two of her adolescent patients were involuntarily sterilized. It is based on a real court case, and it deals with themes of reproductive injustice, racism, class. The case in question also became the basis for the concept of informed consent in healthcare. Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris, probably the best received book that we read this year. It is a debut novel. It was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and it is set at the end of the Civil War. It focuses on themes of race and freedom in the post-war South. Violetta by Isabel Allende. So this book takes place in a unnamed country in South America, and it spans a period of 100 years, and it follows the life of a woman named Violetta. It is bookended by pandemic, so it starts with the Spanish flu and it ends with the COVID pandemic. Parts of this book were also inspired by the author's own family history. And some historical fiction titles that were set in North Carolina. I saw one of these mentioned in the chat earlier. The Girls Who Sent Away. This one is set in the 1960s. It focuses on the baby scoop era. So this is when young unmarried women were sent to homes for unwed mothers and pressured to give their children up for adoption. You have Carolina Built, that was mentioned in the chat earlier. It's the true story of formerly enslaved woman Josephine Leary. She became a businesswoman and a real estate magnate in Edenton, North Carolina. And then the last book I want to mention here is Cape Fear Rising. This is set in Wilmington, which is where I currently live. It is about the Wilmington insurrection. This was a coup d'etat and massacre that happened on November 10th, 1898. It is a very difficult part of Wilmington history that people in the community really did not want to talk about for a long time. We discussed this the first week of November, and it allowed us to align our discussion with memorial events that were happening around our community. And we were able to examine photos and documents from our local history collection to kind of help aid in our discussion. As you can imagine, that was one of our more challenging discussions because it's part of our local history. It's a hard thing for people here to talk about, but it's also a very powerful discussion. Um, yeah.
All right, and now we're going to switch gears and I'll show a little bit about using Novelist Plus. So, Novelist went through a platform refresh over the summer, and you'll notice that all the content that you saw in the previous version of the website is still there, but it's kind of tucked away in different places. You can still search using appeal factors. They also have a rotating sort of selection of appeal factors that you can click on and search for different combinations on the homepage. You can still search by genre. They've added in natural language search, so you don't necessarily need to use like the GN field code for genre. You could put in historical fiction and it would allow you to see results that way. But you can also still search by theme. One thing that I think is particularly helpful for searching for historical fiction is searching by subject. So let's say you want to find books set in the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s in the Midwest, in Plains region of the United States. You can add in that subject filter and it allows you to focus in on that particular area and time period. Whereas if you search by time and place, you'll see kind of different combinations. You can search by the 19th century, but because so many different events are in the 19th century, it follows, Regency period, as well as the antebellum South, as well as the Gilded Age. You have a couple of different options for using that time filter in the search results. And so we'll play around a little bit with that. In terms of getting up to speed with historical fiction, um, if you're new to the genre and you want to see the best of the best really quickly, the curated lists are a great starting point. So they have their must reads for each age range, adult, YA, and ages 9 through 12. They have for fans of lists that they create based on pop culture. So the TV show The Gilded Age, they have for fans of recommended titles if you like that show. They made one for Sinners last year because of the popularity of that movie with some historical fiction and horror recommendations. And then they have Eyewitness to History is another one of their historical fiction lists. If you want really a crash course in like who are the hot authors in the genre for a particular age range, tips for marketing, more detail than just a grab and go book list, that's where I'd recommend going into the genre guides. Those are written by novelist staff and library staff around the country, and they're so comprehensive that I feel like it helps orient you in a genre that you might be unfamiliar with. And then one thing I always do is just search for the genre that I'm looking for, check the box to see recent award winners in the last 5 years or so. That kind of gives me a good idea because novelists with their awards is pulling in big awards like the Booker Prize or Pulitzer or but they're also bringing in library reads, titles that have been acknowledged or Lone Star favorites, some smaller awards for the genre and also just for fiction and nonfiction. So we'll get into the homepage in just a sec. I also want to share that you can use the search GN, so for genre is that field code, book club best bets. You can also add it as a filter later in your search. These are titles that novelists considers good for encouraging thoughtful discussion, as Lee mentioned. Um, they're engaging, they're popular, but maybe not kind of as widely read. And so, a couple that I wanted to pull out that I feel like would be good fits are Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. So, this is a multi-generational saga that follows the descendants of a survivor of the Sand Creek Massacre as they navigate the lingering trauma of history. I'm a huge Karen Russell fan, so I devoured her new book, The Antidote, which is set in the Dust Bowl era. It has elements of magical realism, which might be a deal breaker for some of your readers, but for me, I really enjoyed that. Beasts of the Sea by Ida Turpinen. This is a British book that's a very much a sweeping historical epic. Um, and then Isola by Allegra Goodman, which was mentioned in the chat earlier, is a Reese Witherspoon's book club pick. But this is set in the 19th century, where a young woman sent to a remote island to care for a grieving widow, leading to a very complex character study. And so that's a search that you can do to find some good titles. They also added this great search GN Small Press Standout, so you can find some more hidden gems. Hungerstone by Kat Dunn is technically historical fiction, or not historical fiction. It is historical horror, so it's often marketed as a horror book, but I think is a nice little genre blend that can bring in fans of both horror and historical fiction. It's a gothic historical thriller where a young woman returns to her family estate to find it haunted by both literal ghosts and the shadow of the French Revolution. Canticle is follows a young woman in the 13th century who's caught between her family's secrets and the violent religious upheaval of the Crusades. The Ways of Water by Teresa Jansen is set in the American West in Mexico, and it follows a young girl's journey across that region in the early 20th century, and highlights kind of the struggle for survival amidst social upheaval of the time. And then The Remembered Soldier, which is a National Book Award finalist. This is a very haunting Dutch epic that explores the psychological aftermath of World War I through the eyes of a soldier who returns home with no memory of his past. If you have patrons that um, struggle with stories of war or the complexities of trauma, that might not be a best fit, but I feel like is it's I added it to my TBR because I really enjoy something that feels a little bit more like a character study and exploring the nature of memory, which I think is something that comes up as part of historical fiction. You can search by time period, and so this is a nice way for patrons to browse around in novelists and explore their own taste and maybe even branch out if they find they're kind of stuck in the Tudor period and they want to go to a different time period or location. You can use this filter to search for historical fiction titles. You can even search for specific events, like they do have a filter for the English Civil War, which pulls up the latest Philippa Gregory book, which is the first in a new series. So Tidelands is set around the English Civil War, which is a time period that I'm not as familiar with. And so it's a woman who is an herbalist and a midwife, is sort of caught in this very dangerous situation where she's harboring a fugitive. Um, and is accused of witchcraft, and so she's very much a in a tense situation. Um, the Case of the Missing Maid. This is a really charming historical mystery set in the Gilded Age in Chicago, where a middle class detective is searching for a vanished domestic worker. I like this because I think with the Gilded Age, stories tend to be set in New York if they're set in the United States. And I really liked the flip of a different location and thinking through what Chicago was like around the turn of the century. Um, The Great Divide is a novel that weaves together the lives of those impacted by the monumental and grueling and harrowing construction of the Panama Canal. And so, a good pick if you're looking to switch up the location of titles for a book club and really explore Latin America and a different part of the world. Um, the last one for time period that I pulled up is Rainbow Black, which is set technically in 1989 and 1990, which is sort of towards the end of that what counts as historical fiction marker that we talked about earlier. But this one is set around the Satanic Panic, which is kind of a very interesting moment in time in the 20th century. The main character is queer, and her life is upended when her parents are arrested. And so, really interesting, kind of gritty historical fiction. You can search by theme. So sometimes a reader isn't looking for a date, but is looking more for a feeling or a specific narrative structure. So this is where the themes come in novelist and are great for pulling together a display or a recommended reads list or staff picks, or even figuring out some titles for a book club or a program. Um, the Mercies is inspired by real events. So that's a theme that you can search for if you know your patrons like historical fiction that's inspired by a real event. You can use that search. It's based on a real story that follows a village in Norway around the 17th century where a storm kills all of the local men, and um, the women are forced to survive alone and kind of what comes after that. Um, the theme life during wartime is a common one in historical fiction that you can search for in novelist. Beasts of a Little Land is an epic that's set in Japanese occupied Korea, and it follows the interconnected lives of a young girl who is sold to a courtesan school and a local tiger hunter. Tiananmen Square by Lai Wen. That is actually a pseudonym. It's a debut novel. It is a very poignant story of a young woman's intellectual and emotional awakening leading up to those historic 1989 student protests. So if you want a historical fiction book set in more recent history, you can use that coming of age theme and limit by time period. And then I'm a huge fan of books with large casts of characters. And so Munich's by David Peace is a really powerful novel that's set after the devastating 1958 Munich air disaster and its lasting impact on the Manchester United football team. And so if you want something set in Europe in the mid-century, that's a good pick that also has sort of noir-ish elements. And so if you have patrons that already know that they like mystery and want to kind of branch out a little bit, that might be a good entry point. You can search by appeals. And so these help us describe the style of the writing, and they can kind of help people figure out what elements of a book that they like beyond genre. And so Intricately Plotted is one. What We Tried to Bury Grows Here by Julian Zabalobiskoa. Um, this is a very complex, multi-layered narrative following a group of Basque soldiers during the Spanish Civil War as they struggle with survival. Cinematic is one of my favorite appeals to use in novelist. And so when I did that, it brought up a book that I really love that I read a few years ago called The Good Lord Bird, which is James McBride. So the author of the Heaven and Earth Grocery Store wrote this. And it is about John Brown's abolitionist crusade, but it's told from the perspective of a young slave who joins that crusade, and it has a very good mix of like humor and tragedy. Babylonia came out last year. It's the debut title from the author Costanza Casati. This is very meticulously detailed and well researched, and it's set reimagining the life of Semiramis, who was a legendary queen of Babylon. Um, and so, if you have folks that are fans of Madeline Miller, this might be a nice read alike to bring in from ancient history. And then for character driven, The Spoon Stealer by Leslie Crew. This is a Canadian title. It's very heartwarming and quirky. It's categorized as a gentle read. And so, if your patrons are looking for something on the lighter side, it follows an eccentric woman in the 60s who returns to her family farm in Nova Scotia. And I did not forget about younger readers. So you can search. One thing that I like to do is I do a big genre search in novelists, and then I limit by age range and check the box for award winners, or I'll check the box for certain themes. And here are a couple that came up when I was searching. So, Everything We Never Had by Randy Rebay. This is a very moving novel that follows four generations of Filipino American men as they struggle with expectations and identity. Beneath the Wild Silk Sky by Emily Inuyui is about a Japanese American girl in the Pacific Northwest whose life is shattered after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Um, and so, an interesting twist on the World War II time period. Kwame Alexander is a very popular author of YA and middle grades fiction. I think he's also written a memoir himself. But I wanted to pull in a title that he wrote in the last couple of years, The Door of No Return. This is a novel in verse about a young boy in 19th century Ghana whose life is forever changed by the onset of the transatlantic slave trade. Um, and The Cricket War by Tofam, with illustration by Sandra McTavish. That is a book that is based on a true story about a young boy navigating the dangers of post-war Vietnam as his family attempts a very perilous escape by boat. And then Heart of a Samurai, more for ages 9 through 12, by Margie Bruce, is an award winner. It's the adventurous story of Nakahama Manjiro, a young Japanese fisherman rescued by an American whaling ship in the 1840s. Um, and around that time, few Americans were making their way to Japan. It was just kind of this period of initial exploration with Japan. So, kind of an interesting time capsule there. Um, Now, I'm going to jump into novelists so you can see a little bit of what I mentioned. So, the curated lists, you have, I can click all curated lists, and then I'm going to add in different filters on the right-hand side. So, I like to limit by genre and just pinpoint historical fiction. And I can see there are 9 different lists. A new list dropped this month for Women's History Month. Um, there's must-read historical fiction for adults, YA ages 9 through 12, diverse historical fiction for fans of the Gilded Age, and then eyewitness to history. So if I pull up one of these, they give you a nice description here and the staff, novelist staff or the librarian who prepared it. And so one thing that you can do is you can create an account with a Gmail and save these to your account if you're putting together a display list or you're trying to do some research for programs or for summer reading potentially. Um, but you can also take this list and print it out all together um, and just have this grab and go list. If patrons want to walk around the library and see what titles are available, and if your library's catalog is linked with Novelist, you can then go to the actual book page and see whether it's owned by your library. I'm logged in as NC State, and NC State's catalog is not linked with Novelist. I'm going to go back to the home page and show you here. You can also change the recommended read list here by age range, fiction, and then different custom blends or for fans of. Um, but if you want to see all the lists that are available in Novelist, going to that curated list section is a more comprehensive search. One thing that you can do down here, and share this with your patrons, these appeals rotate, but historical fiction is one of them right now. This is a great tool for exploration. It's a nice icebreaker before staff meetings or a way to kind of explore your own tastes and fall down a rabbit hole. but I can check strong sense of place, historical fiction. Maybe I want some world building, and it's going to give me three different titles that I can explore later. And so here I've got The Wayfinder by Adam Johnson, which was published last year, The Key to Rome, and then How Much of These Hills is Gold, which was published in 2020. So a nice way to kind of break out of some of your searching and get very specific picks. So using that genre search, GN historical fiction, I'm going to go and add in here. I'm going to check the box for award winner. And then I can add in a theme or a time period. So with the 19th century, as I mentioned, there are so many different events within a given century. The 20th century, it's very broad. So I like to go through and see some of the other ones that are available in here by searching. So one thing that I could do is look at the Victorian era. If I want to find books set during the Russian Revolution, I can check that box. I can also search with the keyword ancient and pull up titles from ancient Greece or ancient Egypt. Um, and so let's say I want to find historical fiction set in ancient Egypt that's an award winner, and it gives me 27 different results. Um, it also has forthcoming titles. So Novelist is not only a good place for looking for what's been published in the last couple of years and keeping up to date, but also seeing what will be published this year because books that were popular last year or even this year end up being titles that get put immediately on hold by patrons in the coming months or in the coming year. So good for kind of keeping an eye out and seeing what books end up being particularly buzzy. Um, it's giving me, let's see here. I can also change by source type. So altogether, it gave me three books for this search. And then I can change things up and uncheck a filter. So let's say I want to look at location and I want to see with location here. I'm just gonna add in. So I've got award winner, historical fiction, and then I'm going to go to location and see. There we go. All right. So let's say I want a book that's set in South America. I could add in a couple of different locations if I wanted to. So, is there anything for Caribbean? I could add in here and see a couple of titles recommended. We Are Green and Trembling, which was a National Book Award winner from last year. Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. And then some others back here. So I can change and limit that publication date if I just want to find titles from the last 5 years. It's very flexible in terms of adding in those filters, removing them, seeing what's popular. If I want to uncheck the box for award winners and see something that's a little bit more of a hidden gem that's set in South America, I can go through and explore a little bit further. I can also change this list if I want to see date newest. That might change things up. And then I can look through here and see this book, which is the third in a series, and some read-alikes to explore. I'm going to go back and show I want to add in here. I'm going to uncheck. Look for titles from the last 5 years, and I want to add in for genre. That's where I can add in the book club. Let's see. Oh, I've got too many filters. Just gonna uncheck here. I've got books the past 5 years, and now I'm gonna add in for genre. I could add in book club best bets. I could add in adult books for young adults as one search that I can do for historical fiction, or small press standouts. And this gives me 130 titles to choose from for historical fiction. And this is organized by relevance, but I can see some recent titles and explore a little bit further. Now, if I want to get to the genre guides, all I have to do is go to the quick links tab and jump to genre guides. If I just want to see a list of book club best bets, I can click on that link and it just does the book club best bets search, and I can add in historical fiction as a genre and other filters if I want to use that list that Nautilus has made. But for now, we're just going to go to genre guides, and I'm going to pull in genre and see the historical fiction genre guides. So if I want to find historical fiction for teens, I can see here the explanation of the genre, what happens, some top themes, particularly in historical fiction for teens, um, why readers like this genre, some key titles, and they particularly emphasize recent titles, and then the remix classics. So there have been a lot of remix classics, graphic novel versions of titles in the last couple of years that are being published. Um, One thing in explaining adaptations to younger readers is they are not the exact book that they're adapting, but they are a version of it, and so they're a good way to teach adaptation and reinterpretation, um, and good for historical fiction for YA. And then some key authors to know, and you can click and see author read-alikes this way and what to start with, which is great. And then foundations of historical fiction. So bringing out, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, Island of the Blue Dolphins as being kind of classics that people grew up with. Um, and The Book Thief is another one. And then some authors to watch. And then the end of these guides, they have this section of like, how do I help and market to historical fiction fans? And these are really useful because they have kind of tips and some fun searches to try at the end that are more specific, like haunting historical fiction with a strong sense of place, historical fiction told with multiple perspectives, um, and some other ones to try out. Now, I'm going to go back to the homepage here and show you under advanced search, you can add in grade level or reading Lexile score, so reading level. Um, This is such a good tool for parents to know about, because their kids might be potentially either above grade level with their reading and they want to find a title that's still age appropriate, that's not, YA for a 9-year-old, or something that's an adult title for a 12-year-old. Just finding things that might be challenging reading level wise, but content wise are still in a good age range. Um, and so grade level, I'm going to put in sixth grade and then put in GN historical fiction. And let's see if I add an award winner, what comes up. This gives me 700 different results. I'm just going to check books. You can look at audiobook results if you're looking for historical fiction audiobook recommendations. The audiobook results are good if you're looking for audio specific appeals like distinctly voiced, large cast of characters, read by the author. Some of those descriptors are great if you just want to find audiobook recommendations. But for this age range, let's see, I'm going to pull up this book that was published in October. It's an award winner, grade 4 through 7, and then some read alikes here, and then some searches that I can explore, but a Lone Star Junior's favorite from last year. And then I can scroll through and see, let's say I want to search and add in something by time period. So I want to move beyond and find a different time period. Let's say I want to find something from the 1960s that would count. So this is historical fiction set in the 1960s. That's an award winner for a 6th grade reading level. I can see here Root Magic by Eden Royce. See a description set in South Carolina and some recommended titles here. So this flexibility with searching is not only helpful for adult patrons, but for younger readers, letting teachers know that they can use this, and as well, ages 9 through 12, YA, when kids are developing very specific tastes, they can use this to explore on their own and find titles that are a good fit for them. And then genre blends as well. So this is an example of historical fantasy. If I want to find more historical fantasy, um, that's richly detailed and let's see, has well-developed characters. It's going to give me 46 different books. And then I can always filter by audience for adult, teen, or ages 9 through 12 and see some different examples here. So that's where those filters are really good about just kind of flexibility when you're searching, and taking a list of thousands of titles and making it a more manageable size. I am going to clear it and go back to this homepage and head back into our slides. One thing I did want to make sure is to bring attention to some 2026 releases. So these are some titles that are coming out this year to keep an eye out for. Maggie Farrell has a new book coming out this year, Land. Cleopatra, which we came across in our searches, is a feminist reimagining of the Egyptian queen's rise to power and her fight to preserve her empire. A Perfect Hand is a sophisticated historical mystery that explores family legacies and secrets set against the backdrop of mid-century Europe. The Fortune Tellers of Rue Daru is set in early 20th century Paris. Three Russian immigrant sisters use their wits and supposed mystical powers to survive the aftermath of the revolution. Now I Surrender by Alvaro Enrique. It's a very much a experimental historical novel that reimagines the final days of the Apache Wars. Colson Whitehead has The Cool Machine, which is set in the 1980s in New York and is the final one in the trilogy set in the mid 20th century in Harlem. The Geomagician by Jennifer Mandula is a blend of history and fantasy set during the Roman Empire. And following the success of Hamnet, Land is very much an exploration of the emotional and historical connection between people and the landscapes that they inhabit. So great way to keep up with titles that are coming out this year is checking the box for forthcoming, or even just changing your search results to date newest so that you can see what's coming up. So we're going to switch gears and cover some best practices for helping readers either on the desk or in programs.
So kind of going back to some of the things we talked about, pull out those hidden gems or those less explored time periods. One thing you want to ask yourself, and maybe your book club as well, is what time periods and parts of the world they are most interested in learning about, and kind of use that as a starting point for selecting your titles. What don't you know already? What haven't you read already? Look for those fresh perspectives. Ask yourself whose story has not been told. That can be a really great way when you're like approaching finding some of those hidden gem titles. You want to try to, if at all possible, provide resources for patrons who want to continue to explore the history of a time or place. When patrons connect with a book, they are naturally going to want to delve a bit deeper into that history. So it can be really helpful to have some, maybe nonfiction titles or other available electronic resources on hand that you can refer people to if they express an interest in learning more. Encourage some conversation about how the title might relate to people's lived experience. This is a question that I love to bring up at book discussions. It really brings up some really great opportunities for people to connect not only with each other, but to kind of connect deeper with the text. Especially true when you're discussing time periods that people might remember or might be within their lived history, or maybe their families have stories about. And the last thing is, be prepared to discuss difficult topics. When it comes to historical fiction, you're going to be discussing difficult topics, and they're not easy conversations to always have. But they can also spark some really engaging and meaningful discussion. Historical fiction, in a lot of ways, I think really lends itself to deep conversation. So just make sure that you're prepared to help facilitate those conversations, especially, on sensitive subjects, and that you're providing an atmosphere where people can discuss that. And a few questions that you can ask your club when you're selecting titles. Is there a particular time period or a location you like to focus on? You do want to make sure that you're offering a variety of time periods and places to kind of keep those selections fresh, but you also want to make sure that you're including things that people are interested in learning about. Um, Ask what other genres they read. This can help with those genre blends we talked about. Do they like mystery? Are they romance readers? Are they open to titles that maybe include magical realism? Because people can have very mixed feelings about that. Ask them, do they need the book to be very historically accurate, or are they more interested in a particular time period? Because different authors are going to put different levels of research into historical fiction, and it's really good to know what your club's expectation is. And this is actually a really interesting topic was, are you interested in books from the point of view of real historical figures? And this can actually be a really polarizing topic in book clubs when you're talking about real people. So an example, we read Hester by Laurie Lico Albanese in our book club. It imagines the inspiration for Hester Prynne, the protagonist of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. And the muse of the story is entirely fictional. However, Nathaniel Hawthorne was very much a real person, and he's not necessarily always portrayed in the best light at times of the book. And people can have very mixed feelings about that, when it comes to historical fiction. Historical figures. Think about the different ways that a character like Anne Boleyn has been depicted across various fiction. It can spark some very good conversations in your book club about sort of the lens through which we view history and these historical figures.
And then in terms of keeping up with trends, keep an eye out for those for fans of lists and novelist. They made one for Shogun. I think they've updated their Bridgerton one recently, and they did make one for Sinners that you can search for. Um, and just a couple that have come up on Book Talk and Bookstagram and just social media in the last few years. I've been so tickled by the fact that people, younger readers, are discovering Larry McMurtry and Lonesome Dove, which is one of my favorite books. It's a Western, but it does, I think, count under historical fiction. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is one that's really made the rounds and took off through social media discovery. And then The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna is another one that I feel like has been just like if you like historical fiction, always ends up being shown in different reels and posts on social media. And then Lee added in Thornburns by Colleen McCullough as an example. I love keeping up with Reader's Advisory through podcasts, and there's the History Through Fiction podcast specifically for historical fiction. They cover different books and authors. Um, and I've included some other podcast recommendations in the Google Doc that you'll see. I just want to highlight some of the historical fiction audiobooks that we have in our permanent collection in Hoopla. We have a couple of Isabel Allende titles. We have a few from James Lee Burke, who's a mystery writer, but The Wayfaring Stranger is set during World War II in the oil fields of Texas. And then we have a few James L. Roy novels as well, and the All the Light We Cannot See, which was adapted recently into a movie. Our homegrown collection is all available in Libby. It's primarily ebooks, but they are unlimited simultaneous use, so no wait lists or checkout holds required. An entire community can read the same book at the same time. We just added in The Devil's Done Come Back, which is a curated collection of Southern Gothic and historical stories that explore the kind of hidden corners of North Carolina history. So a good pick if your book club is more short story focused, um, or you want to add that into a program. And then Tyree Jones, we have a couple of different titles from Tyree Jones. Silver Sparrow is set in 1980s Atlanta. And then How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents by Julia Alvarez is follows four sisters as they flee the dictatorship in the Dominican Republic and start a new life in New York City. We created a book club kit for that title as well as a couple other popular fiction titles in the collection. You can find that on our promotional materials page if you want just kind of a ready-made discussion guide for a book club. And then marketing tips and resources. I'm just going to kind of run through this so that you can access these slides later. But just a kind of high-level overview of some of these recommendations. We have that promotional materials page where you can pull in materials from novelists that you can order through us for free and have shipped to your library. So as you're preparing for summer reading, if you want to order anything, again, for free, you can check the box for novelist. We make materials for our homegrown collection to promote the access in Libby. And then just target readers with print. Pulling out bookmarks for novelists, putting them in holds and book boxes by displays, just encouraging that exploration because I think with readers, once they get set up and use Novelist, it's such a fantastic tool to return to again and again and figure out and explore and find new titles. Um, Novelist has also updated and given us a lot more marketing materials with the new platform refresh. So we have tons more posters and flyers that you can use and order, integrating them into book clubs, author talks, reading challenges, and story times. Just having that physical reminder to tie in to all the great programs that you're doing at your libraries. And then you can link your catalog so that patrons, once they are on Novelist, they can see what's available in your library, and that kind of facilitates discovery and allows them to hone in on what's available at the library quickly. And if you need help with that, you can email help@nclive.org and we'll get you set up. Any questions? Feel free to share them in the chat or unmute yourself. Oh, good. I'm so glad, Morgan. You can also get in touch with us after the webinar if you have any questions about NC Live collections using Novelist. Feel free to email me. And if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of hosting a historical fiction book club and bringing in titles set in North Carolina, um, email and reach out to Lee as well. And Lee, I cannot thank you enough for being such a fantastic co-host. I feel like you gave such a good explanation of the tensions and questions that come up in this genre that
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's especially when you dig into that time frame of what qualifies. That is, it's a really controversial question.
Hmm. Definitely. Um, and unnerving to think that that time frame is getting closer into the
No,
90s.
yeah,
If I
yeah,
start reading
it's
historical fiction set in the 2000s, I think it might freak me out a
yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, but I mean, but if you think about it too, like I don't when I saw, the 1980s, I'm like, I was born in the 80s. I don't know, but there's a lot of really important things that happen. It was a very distinct time period. So, there's a lot of stuff that happened then that it could under certain
Hmm.
circumstances.
Definitely. And I do want to share with you all the Google Doc handout that we've prepared. So I'll link to the slides in this handout. You'll see this in the follow-up email. I'll add in titles that you added in the chat, and then I'll make sure that we have the full list of titles from the webinar today so that y'all can peruse this later. Um, but with that, I know we're a little bit before 3:15. If folks don't have any questions, we can wrap up. Um, and I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Tuesday.